and relationships are built between humans, not between institutions. And often we go through organizations like the AFN to coordinate our engagements. And when you're not part of an organizing body, how do you have that nation-to-nation relationship when it grows and math gets in the way and it gets harder and harder to have personal relationships at that scale? So that is one of the challenges that we face, and I'm just one department. We have many departments. We're a large organization that seems faceless, but we're human too, and we are looking for the opportunities to build those relationships. We have our first question.
Good afternoon. My name is Charlie Coots, and I'm from Vancouver Island and part of the Monmouth Treaty Society. We've been in existence since 2011, April 1st. I have a question I think it's for the Yukon, who mentioned that they have 39,000 square miles of fee simple land. Is that what the number was? Something like that. Anyway, my question, I guess, is how do you work that land with your citizens? Do they have to buy it, or is there grandfathering of people who were settled on that land before the fee simple decision was made? And some of our nations are facing the same issues about giving unrestricted fee simple lands as our status of our lands. So that's my question.
Let's see, for your question, that 39,000 square kilometers of fee simple is with the Clinchon in the Northwest Territories. That land is vested within the Clinchon government and the people, and there are only a handful of third-party interests that's on the land, and we call those donut holes. And they're usually the mining companies that had prior lease before the effective date. And again, there's not that many of them. And there's one Northwest Power Corporation has a dam that runs through some of the lakes there, and so there's those interests that are donut hole. And other than that, there's really not much third-party interest concerns. And so I know which treaties you're talking about in the Manoth. I have little bit knowledge about that, and there are concerns about third-party interests out there, but within the Clinchon, we really don't have those kind of issues.
Somebody else coming up there's people standing. They're fighting over the mic.
Good afternoon. I'm Nadir Andre, a partner at BLG, a national law firm. It's on the poster. My question is with regards to the Clichat Treaty. I noticed many years ago when I read the agreement that you have a history with one historical treaty that you manage to integrate into a modern treaty. I'd like to hear you on how that's feasible and what does that imply to have some of those provisions of this number treaty integrated into a modern agreement, if you have that answer.
Masi, that's an excellent question, because we get asked that once in a while. There are those that are very staunch historical treaty holders and modern treaties. So Mufi in 1921, when he signed Treaty 11 on behalf of the Clinchon, he laid out the traditional territory. And so our agreement recognizes that traditional territory that he laid out for us. And the words that he used are very strong words that we keep to today. And so even though there's some disagreements about what's in Treaty 11, but the Clinchon have built on that treaty into what is today. And so we recognize and still have a lot of respect and recognition for the historical Treaty 11. And so, but the modern treaty is building up on that and more. And so we always say that we never done away with our treaty. We never gave up our treaty. We still have it. And we have that along with the Clinchon agreement.
Thank you. Martin Papillon from the University of Montreal. I'm part of the Modern Treaty Implementation Research Project that has a nice booth there. And I'm, no one in the booth though. I'm interested in intergovernmental relations as part of that research project, so this is quite topical. And one thing I've heard in discussion exchange that I've had on intergovernmental relations under modern treaties, and I would like to have your opinion on this or your perspective, is the idea that you reach a point where there's actually too much intergovernmental relations, too much negotiation going on, too much, not that relationship is a bad thing, but at some point resources are scarce and you need to actually do things rather than negotiating over what should be done. And I'm wondering if this echoes your experience, or what are your perspective on this? Thank you.
Go for it.
Oh, who's asking? You. Oh, okay, sorry. In my experience, I've been involved in setting up of Clinchon government, shutting down the 4 bans in Treaty 11 and creating Clinchon government overnight. I've been involved with implementation since day one, and prior to that, pre-effective date implementation. And you're right, when do you stop negotiating and start implementing? And I like to point out that in the last 3 years, things have shifted completely into implementation. Collaboration is the huge buzzword these days. It's no longer a buzzword, but it's an actual thing that goes on. And so, a very good example for us is the intergovernmental services, ISA, Intergovernmental Services Agreement that we have with GNWT in Canada. And we have some colleagues here from GNWT listening in on this, and it's a huge shift to stop talking about negotiations and start talking about collaboration and how do you change things together. And again, trust is a huge thing. You have to park your mistrust at the door and start talking and dialoguing and actually talking about how you feel about the agreement, the spirit and intent, and go from there. And so, negotiations these days is not really a word that's used. It's collaborative discussions. That's the new word that we've using it for. And so fiscal collaboration, fiscal policy work is another very huge good example that we're hoping that the various departments that we need to work with will start taking on that kind of approach. And so, negotiations, hoping that'll be a thing of the past, and that collaborative discussions and collaboratively drafting and having those kind of good work happening and being respected and honored is, the future to go, I hope. Masi.
Yeah.
I'm feeling bold, so I'm going to answer your question too. I don't think that too much negotiations is a problem. When you start feeling that need of that we've been negotiating too long, I would consider that as growing pains. And at that point, your team needs to grow, whether that be growing in more negotiators or growing in doers. I was fortunate enough to, during some negotiations, be actually hired on to do work. I am a language and history coordinator when I'm not a full-time student or a full-time committee member or a full-time, I like doing things, and I'm very fortunate to have one of those positions within my nation to be a doer. So if you feel the need that it's been too much negotiations, perhaps you need to spend some more money and hire people to do some of those things for you. Choo.
Just gonna, is that on? Yeah, just gonna add to that. We do find, I'm gonna speak specifically from Huaid's experience, from my experience, though I will mention Monolith as a collective. It does take a lot of resources, and not all nations have the same resources and capacity, and this is where there's a real advantage to working collectively. Monolith is unique in that it's 5 different nations under one treaty, but if you look, our laws are all different, our government structures are all different. So you can create opportunities to work together, to share some of those human resources and financial resources, because many of our communities are quite small. I'm sure that's common, and you can't all have a 50-person staff to take this on. So in cases like that, I would really look for opportunities to collaborate internal with other Indigenous governments. And it can be a burden to constantly teach the government. That's true. It's exhausting, and no matter how hard you try, they always have turnover. But the goal in this is to change the relationship, and that takes time, and that takes teaching. And if we're successful, we will change the relationship and therefore start to change their internal culture, and they can start to teach each other, and we won't have such a burden, and that would, I expect, make negotiations, discussions, collaborative efforts a lot easier.
We have time for one more question if anybody wants to jump up to the mic. Or I'll ask the last question. So building on what Crystal said, what's your vision of how you see collaboration amongst self-governing Indigenous nations coming together, whether it's with other Monolith Treaty holders or other BC self-governing First Nations, or on the Yukon circumstance or the Northwest Territories circumstance? How does that collaboration work today, and how could you see that strengthening in the future versus wanting to have a bilateral relationship? I guess, what areas would you be willing to work together with others versus wanting to have that singular bilateral relationship with the federal government?
I got to push the button. I think that there's an opportunity to use branding. If all of the self-governance who are working on their own pieces find a brand, find a word, find a hashtag, all of a sudden a lot of this stuff that's out there is accessible, whether you be on Vancouver Island, the Yukon, or out in PEI. If we have something that we are all same language, that's what I'm really talking about, is find a same language. Hashtag self-governance. If you Google that one today, by the way, you'll see this speech. I shared it. But I'm serious though, if we find a branding that works, finding a branding that is applicable to all of our self-governments, all of a sudden we're searchable online, we're searchable on social media, that information is a lot more accessible. So accessibility and branding, I think, would be a really big opportunity.
Having been involved in previous government and in negotiations and implementation work, and again, I can only refer to the last 3 years of the last 4 years of the Trudeau government, and the change in the bureaucracy and how they think. When you have an assistant deputy minister at your fiscal meeting talking about first time ever decolonization, about reconciliation, and that we need that as a federal government and the bureaucracy and the people that work there, and that they have started thinking like that. It's a huge shift. And so collaboration as I said, is the work that we've been doing, not just with the federal team, but also within GNWT. I see that happening. And they're asking you, okay, how should we do this? And talking about the importance of language, culture, and way of life for each of the agreements and the people is again, a huge shift. And and it's been stated before in many of the readings that I've done and in talking to people that when it comes to agreements, whether it's historical agreements or modern treaty agreements or self-government agreements, that it shouldn't be politicized, but it is. And so if we could get that shift of thinking that it's an agreement between nations that needs to be respected and honored, then collaboration can be achieved at every table, everywhere. We talk about UNDRIP and reconciliation and all those efforts, but again, if we could get them to think that this is an obligation that they have, regardless of who's in power, that they need to be respected and honored, and to be able to work together effectively in making sure that those agreement obligations and commitment and the spirit and intent is met. I think we still have a long ways to go, but it's a good start. And I've been at both sides, from one to the other, and the shift in the thinking is happening, and it's a huge thing. But to be able to park your mistrust at the door and walk into a room with our counterparts and have those meaningful discussion, I'm seeing it happening, and it's a good thing. If the outcome in the end is to achieve what you're there to do together, then it's all worth it.
Mine is also short. I can't really speak on behalf of each of the nations in terms of what they'd want to collaborate on, but when I was preparing last week for this, I was asking quite a few people what they thought would be a response to how these engagements or these collaborations could change going forward. And some of the big things I really heard was not coming to communities with established processes and frameworks already set up, but actually starting from the very beginning in that collaboration and that partnership and asking First Nations what they want the framework or the structure to look like, and how can we embed culture and tradition and perhaps traditional laws into those processes and frameworks. And also ensuring that employees at both the federal, territorial, provincial levels are really understanding the cultures, the histories, the principles and intents of the agreements, and spending a lot more time in the communities when they're working in those collaborative relationships. Thanks.
In the way that I approach it in my position, I would say in terms of bilateral versus opportunities for collaboration, this is about, you want to respect the nation's status, so in very simple terms, you want bilateral, or, in the case of Monolith, a 7-nation, but those kind of nation to nation when it's regional, when it's local, when it's specific to you. But what we all have in common is really large systemic issues, and those issues require bigger voices, louder voices, and larger collectives to really be heard. And collaboration doesn't have to mean sitting down in a room and writing out an agreement. This conference is a collaboration, right? We're here to learn from one another. When Monolith was creating their treaty, we looked to the Yukon, to Nisga'a, to Swasin, and we were trying to create opportunities for ourselves to share that with others going through the same experience. So I certainly would look at those systemic issues, or in supporting other nations working towards self-government agreements or towards treaty.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. That is all our time. Please join me in thanking our presenters today. It's now a break time. I believe there's coffee being served, and it's time to network. So please mingle and get to know your fellow collaborators.